My name is Beverly, and I'm 64 years old. For the last 15 years, I've been living what most people would call a lie. Not the kind of lie that hurts others, but the kind that protects you from discovering just how cruel the people you love can really be. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was sitting in my small apartment, the one I'd been renting since my husband died, surrounded by the modest furniture I'd carefully chosen to maintain my image. The apartment wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that barely fit a couch and coffee table. It was exactly what someone would expect a retired nurse on a fixed income to live in. I dialed Mark's number, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed the buttons. My grandson Tyler was turning 8 next week, and I wanted to ask if I could take him to the zoo for his birthday. It was a simple request. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching, the kind any grandmother should be able to make without fear. Hello? Mark's voice sounded tired, distracted. Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice light and cheerful. I was wondering if I could take Tyler to the zoo this Saturday for his birthday. I know how much he loves the elephants. There was a pause. I could hear Jessica in the background, her voice sharp and impatient. Who is it? Tell me it's not your mother again. It's about Tyler's birthday, Mark said to her, his hand probably covering the phone, but not well enough. That's when I heard it. The words that would replay in my mind for days afterward, each syllable like a knife cutting deeper into my heart. Hang up. Ignore that unbearable old woman. She's a burden. Jessica's voice was clear, cold, filled with a disgust that made my breath catch in my throat. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't trying to hide her contempt. She simply didn't care if I heard her. I stayed silent, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles turned white. Mark cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mom, are you there? Yes, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm here. About Saturday. Jessica thinks Tyler has too much planned already. Maybe another time? Another time. Always another time. For 3 years, it had been another time for birthday parties, for Christmas morning, for school plays. Jessica had systematically erased me from my grandson's life, and my son had let her do it. Of course, I said, forcing the words out. I understand. But I didn't understand. I understood perfectly, and that was the problem. Jessica saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, a burden to be tolerated and pushed aside. In her eyes, I was just a sad old woman clinging to a family that had outgrown her. Thanks for understanding. Mom, I'll call you later this week, okay? Okay, I whispered. The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone long after the dial tone began. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I looked around at my carefully maintained image, the worn furniture, the bargain store decorations, the photographs of Mark and Tyler that Jessica had gradually made sure I appeared in less and less frequently. What Jessica didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that this modest little apartment was just one of 15 properties I owned throughout the city. The house where she lived with Mark, the house where she treated me like an unwelcome guest whenever I dared to visit, belonged to me. Every brick, every window, every carefully planted flower in the garden that she took such pride in, all of it was mine. When my father died 5 years ago, he left me everything: 15 rental properties, a small fortune in investments, and the house where Mark now lived. My father had been a quiet man who'd spent his life buying and fixing up properties, never showing off his wealth, never drawing attention to himself. He'd taught me the value of keeping your cards close to your chest, of never letting people know how much you really had. I'd inherited his wisdom along with his money. I never told Mark about the inheritance. I never told him that the house he thought Jessica had convinced him to buy with their combined savings was actually a gift from me. I'd arranged for the sale through lawyers, made it look like a lucky break on the market, a house they could afford just barely with their budget. Mark was so proud of what he thought they'd accomplished together, so grateful to Jessica for finding such a perfect home. For 3 years, I'd watched Jessica treat that house like her personal kingdom. She'd redecorated it from top to bottom, spending money they barely had on expensive furniture and artwork. She'd thrown elaborate dinner parties for her friends, showing off her beautiful home. She'd turned the guest room, the room I used to stay in when I visited, into her home office, claiming she needed the space for her freelance graphic design work. The few times I'd been allowed to visit, she'd made it clear that I was there on sufferance. She'd serve dinner on paper plates when I was there, saving the good china for when I wasn't. She'd remind me to use the guest bathroom downstairs, not the master bathroom upstairs. She'd speak to me in the tone you'd use with a difficult child, all false patience and barely concealed irritation. Beverly, could you please not rearrange the magazines? I have them organized just the way I like them. Beverly, would you mind eating in the kitchen? We're trying to keep the dining room nice for when we have real company. Beverly, I know you mean well, but Tyler doesn't need you filling his head with all those old stories. We're trying to raise him with more modern values. Real company. Modern values. As if I were some relic from a bygone era, too outdated to be around my own grandson. The worst part wasn't the way she treated me. It was the way she'd convinced Mark that her treatment was justified. She'd somehow made him believe that I was the problem, that I was too needy, too demanding, too much work for their busy modern life. She'd painted herself as the patient daughter-in-law who was doing her best to include a difficult mother-in-law, and Mark had bought every word of it. I stood up from my chair, my legs shaky from the emotions coursing through me. I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, pulling out a manila folder that contained copies of all the property deeds. 15 properties, including the one where Jessica was right now, probably cooking dinner in the kitchen she thought belonged to her. I spread the papers out on my bed, running my fingers over the legal language that proved what everyone had forgotten. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a needy old woman depending on my son's charity. I was a property owner, a landlord, a woman of means who had chosen to live quietly and simply, but being called a burden, hearing the contempt in Jessica's voice, knowing that she'd rather my grandson never see me again, that was the end of my patience. I gathered up the papers and put them back in the folder. Tomorrow, I would drive to Jessica and Mark's house. Tomorrow, I would knock on the door of the house that belonged to me. And tomorrow, Jessica would learn exactly who she'd been talking about when she called me an unbearable old woman and a burden. I had been silent long enough. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Jessica's voice again. Hang up. Ignore that unbearable old woman. She's a burden. The words echoed in my mind like a poison that had finally found its way to the surface after years of building up in my system. I made coffee at 5 a.m. and sat at my small kitchen table, staring out the window at the city slowly waking up. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, in my modest little apartment, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, while the woman who despised me was probably sleeping peacefully in the master bedroom of my house, under sheets she'd bought with money she could barely afford, in a room she'd decorated with furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The house at 847 Maple Street. I could still remember the day I first saw it 3 years ago, when the previous owner was getting ready to move. It was a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and a backyard perfect for children to play in. The asking price was $485,000, well within my budget, but far beyond what Mark and Jessica could afford on their combined salaries. I'd bought it through my lawyers, had them structure the sale to make it look like the seller was motivated to close quickly and willing to accept a much lower offer. Mark thought he'd negotiated the deal of a lifetime when they got it for $315,000. He'd been so proud, calling me that evening to share the good news. Mom, you won't believe it. We got the house. Jessica found this place, and somehow we managed to get it for way under asking price. The seller needed to move fast for a job, and we were the only buyers who could close quickly. I'd congratulated him, told him how happy I was for them, how proud I was that they'd worked so hard to achieve their dream of home ownership. I hadn't mentioned that I'd paid the difference between what they offered and what the seller needed. I hadn't told him that their dream home was actually a gift from his mother. I'd had my reasons for keeping it secret. After my husband died, I'd watched too many families torn apart by money. I'd seen children who only visited their parents when they needed financial help, relationships that became transactions, love that disappeared the moment the inheritance was divided. I'd wanted to know that Mark loved me for who I was, not what I could give him. But more than that, I'd wanted to see what kind of woman Jessica really was. I'd had my suspicions from the beginning, the way she spoke to servers in restaurants, the way she treated the grocery store clerks, the little comments she made about people who didn't take care of themselves or who made poor life choices. I'd seen enough red flags to fill a parade, but Mark was so besotted with her that he couldn't see any of them, so I'd decided to test her. I'd bought them a house and waited to see how she'd treat the woman she thought was just a poor retired nurse living on Social Security. The results had been worse than I'd imagined. Within 6 months of moving in, Jessica had made it clear that I was no longer welcome for Sunday dinners. We're just so busy with the new house, she'd explained to Mark. Maybe once we get settled, we can go back to regular family meals. That had been 2.5 years ago. When Tyler was born, I'd offered to help with babysitting. Jessica had smiled that fake smile of hers and said, "That's so sweet of you to offer, but we really want to handle things ourselves for now. You understand, right? New parents need to figure things out on their own." I'd understood perfectly. She didn't want her son exposed to his grandmother's influence any more than absolutely necessary. The visiting restrictions had started small. "Could you call before coming over? We might not be home." Then they became more specific. "Weekends are really busy for us. Maybe you could visit during the week when Tyler's at daycare." Eventually, they'd become nearly impossible. "We're just going through a really hectic period right now. Let us get back to you about when might work." And through it all, Mark had gone along with every excuse, every limitation, every gradually tightening restriction on my access to my own family. Jessica had done such a masterful job of positioning herself as the reasonable one, the one trying to balance everyone's needs, that Mark couldn't see what was really happening. I'd watched her redecorate my house room by room, posting photos on social media of her beautiful home. I'd seen her throw dinner parties for her friends, watched through the windows as she played hostess in my dining room, serving guests on china I'd helped her pick out, thinking she was buying it with her own money. She'd turned the guest room, the room where I used to stay when I visited, into her home office. She'd had the walls painted a soft blue, installed built-in shelving, bought an expensive desk and chair. She'd told Mark it was necessary for her freelance work, that she needed a professional space to meet with clients. The truth was, she'd wanted to make sure there was no place for me in that house. No guest room meant no overnight visits. No overnight visits meant no real relationship with my grandson. I'd bitten my tongue through all of it. I'd smiled and nodded when she showed me the improvements she was making to their home. I'd complimented her decorating choices, even when she'd removed every family photo that included me from the main living areas. I'd pretended not to notice when she'd replaced the couch where Tyler and I used to read books together with a white leather sofa that was too nice for children to play on. But yesterday's phone call had been different. Yesterday, she hadn't been content to just exclude me or ignore me. Yesterday, she'd called me a burden to my face, or at least close enough to my face that she knew I could hear her. I finished my coffee and walked to my bedroom, pulling out the folder of property deeds again. 15 properties, worth a combined total of just over $3 million. The house at 847 Maple Street was actually one of the smaller ones, but it was the one that mattered most because it was where my family lived. My family. I almost laughed at the irony. Jessica had spent 3 years trying to push me out of her family, never realizing that she was living in my house, cooking in my kitchen, sleeping in my bedroom. I pulled out the deed for 847 Maple Street and read through it again, even though I knew every word by heart. Beverly Catherine Morrison, sole owner in FI Simple Absolute. The language was clear and unambiguous. I owned that house completely, with no liens, no co-owners, no limitations on my rights as the owner, which meant I had every legal right to sell it. I'd never seriously considered selling it before. The house was supposed to be my gift to Mark and Tyler, something they'd inherit someday when I was gone. I'd imagined Mark raising his son there, maybe even his grandchildren someday. I'd pictured family gatherings in that backyard, Tyler learning to ride a bike on that driveway, Christmas mornings in that living room. But those dreams had died slowly over the past 3 years, killed by 1,000 small cruelties and exclusions. Jessica had made it clear that there was no place for me in the family she was building with my son. She'd turned my gift into her weapon, using my own generosity against me. I looked at my phone, sitting silent on the kitchen counter. No return call from Mark. No follow-up message asking if I was okay after the abrupt end to our conversation. He'd probably already forgotten about my request to take Tyler to the zoo, probably already moved on to whatever Jessica had planned for their evening. That's when I made my decision. I walked to my desk and pulled out a legal pad, then started making a list of everything I needed to do. First, I'd call my lawyer and start the paperwork to put the house on the market. Then I'd contact a realtor, someone who specialized in quick sales to investors. Finally, I'd drive to 847 Maple Street and deliver the news myself. Jessica wanted to call me a burden. Tomorrow, she'd find out exactly what kind of burden I really was. I spent the morning making phone calls. First to my lawyer, Robert Chen, who'd been handling my father's estate and my property management for years. He wasn't surprised when I told him I wanted to sell 847 Maple Street. "Are you sure about this, Beverly?" he asked, his voice careful and professional. "It's a beautiful property, and the market value has only gone up since you purchased it." "I'm absolutely sure," I said. "I want it sold as quickly as possible. Price isn't the primary concern." "I see. And your son? Does he know about this decision?" I paused, staring out my window at the morning traffic. He'll know soon enough. Robert didn't ask any more questions. He'd been my father's lawyer for 20 years before becoming mine, and he understood the value of discretion. We arranged to meet that afternoon to start the paperwork. My next call was to Sandra Williams, a realtor who specialized in quick sales to investors. I'd used her services before when I needed to move properties fast. She was efficient, discreet, and she didn't ask unnecessary questions about my motivations. "The house at 847 Maple Street?" she said when I gave her the address. "I know that neighborhood well. Beautiful area. Are you looking for a quick sale or trying to maximize profit?" "Quick sale. I want it on the market today if possible, with a closing date within 2 weeks. That's aggressive, but doable if you're willing to price it appropriately. I can have potential buyers viewing it as early as tomorrow." Perfect. I hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. For 3 years, I'd been carrying the weight of watching my family slip away from me, watching Jessica systematically erase me from their lives while living in my house. Today, that weight was finally lifting. But as I sat there in my small apartment, the anger that had been simmering since yesterday's phone call began to surface in waves. I found myself remembering every slight, every cruel comment, every moment when Jessica had made me feel like an unwelcome intruder in my own property. The worst incident had happened 6 months ago, during Tyler's 6th birthday party. I'd been invited, grudgingly, but Jessica had made it clear that my presence was more of an obligation than a celebration. I'd arrived with a carefully chosen gift, a set of children's books about space exploration that I'd thought Tyler would love. He'd been fascinated by astronauts lately, constantly talking about rockets and planets, but when I'd handed him the wrapped package, Jessica had immediately intercepted it. "Oh, how thoughtful," she'd said with that fake smile. "We'll put this with the other gifts, and Tyler can open it later when things calm down." Later never came. I'd watched Tyler open present after present from Jessica's friends and family, but my gift had remained on the table, forgotten. When I'd finally asked about it as the party was ending, Jessica had waved her hand dismissively. "We're just trying to pace things out. Too many presents at once can be overwhelming for children. We'll save yours for a quiet moment." I'd left that day knowing Tyler would never see those books, never even know I'd brought them. Jessica would probably donate them to charity or throw them away. Just another piece of evidence of my irrelevance erased from her perfect narrative. But it was the small, daily humiliations that had worn me down the most. The way Jessica would answer the door when I visited as if she were surprised to see me, even when I'd called ahead. The way she'd serve me coffee in a chipped mug while everyone else got the good china. The way she'd redirect conversations away from me whenever I tried to share a story or offer advice. I remembered one particularly painful evening when I'd been invited to dinner, a rare occurrence. Jessica had spent the entire meal talking about her work, her friends, her plans for redecorating the living room. Every time I'd tried to contribute to the conversation, she'd found a way to shut it down. "Beverly, that's an interesting perspective, but I think we're looking for something more contemporary." "Oh, that reminds me of something my friend Sarah said." "Sarah, you'd love her, Mark. She's an interior designer." By the end of the evening, I'd barely spoken 10 words. I might as well have been invisible. The most crushing blow had come last Christmas. I'd been so excited to spend the holiday with Tyler, to see his face when he opened presents, to share in the magic of the season with my only grandchild. But when I'd arrived Christmas morning, I'd found the living room already destroyed by wrapping paper and empty boxes. "Oh, Beverly," Jessica had exclaimed when she saw me standing in the doorway. "I'm so sorry. Tyler was just so excited he couldn't wait any longer. We tried to call you, but it went straight to voicemail." I'd checked my phone immediately. No missed calls. No voicemails. She'd been lying to my face, and we both knew it. Tyler had been in the corner, already absorbed in his new video game, surrounded by expensive toys and gadgets. When I'd given him my gift, a hand-knitted sweater I'd spent weeks making, he'd barely looked up from his screen. "Thanks, Grandma," he'd mumbled, not even unwrapping it properly. Jessica had swooped in immediately. "Tyler, what do you say when someone gives you a present?" "Thank you," he'd repeated automatically, still not looking at me. That was the moment I'd realized I was losing him. Jessica wasn't just pushing me out of Mark's life. She was erasing me from Tyler's childhood, making sure he grew up thinking of me as nothing more than an obligatory relative who showed up occasionally with unwanted gifts. The worst part was how she'd managed to make it all seem natural, even reasonable. When Mark asked why I didn't visit more often, she'd mention how busy they were, how stressful it was to entertain guests when they were trying to manage their careers and raise a child. When he noticed that Tyler seemed distant from me, She'd suggest that children naturally prefer younger, more energetic grandparents, that it was normal for him to be more interested in activities than conversations. She'd painted me as the typical elderly relative, well-meaning but out of touch, loving but ultimately irrelevant to their modern family's needs. And Mark, desperate to keep peace in his marriage, had chosen to believe her version of reality rather than look too closely at what was really happening. But yesterday's phone call had stripped away all pretense. "Ignore that unbearable old woman, she's a burden." There was no room for interpretation in those words, no way to rationalize them as anything other than pure contempt. I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall. It was almost noon. In a few hours, I'd be meeting with Robert to sign the paperwork that would put Jessica's world on the market. By tomorrow morning, strangers would be walking through her home, evaluating her furniture, critiquing her decorating choices, treating her sanctuary like a commodity to be bought and sold. The irony was delicious. For 3 years, Jessica had treated me like I was nothing, like I was a burden to be tolerated and ultimately discarded. Tomorrow, she'd discover that the woman she'd dismissed so casually held the power to take away everything she'd built her identity around. I wasn't just going to show up with papers to sign. I was going to watch her face when she realized that the home she'd spent 3 years perfecting, the status symbol she'd used to define herself, the foundation of her carefully constructed life, all of it belonged to the unbearable old woman she'd been so eager to ignore. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. For a moment, I hoped it might be Mark calling to apologize for yesterday, to invite me to take Tyler to the zoo after all. It was Jessica. "Beverly?" Her voice was sickeningly sweet, the way it always was when she wanted something. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." I almost laughed. After 3 years of being made to feel like every moment I existed was a bad time for her, she was worried about catching me at a bad time. "Not at all," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I was thinking about yesterday, and I felt terrible about how rushed Mark sounded on the phone. You know how he gets when he's stressed about work. I thought maybe we could arrange something special for Tyler's birthday, after all." The lies came so easily to her. Mark hadn't sounded rushed. He'd sounded uncomfortable, caught between his mother and his wife, ultimately choosing his wife as he always did. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "I was thinking maybe you could take him to lunch somewhere nice. Just the two of you? I know how much he loves spending time with his grandmother." Another lie. Tyler barely acknowledged my existence when I was around, thanks to 3 years of Jessica's careful conditioning. "I'd love that," I said, and I meant it. It would be the last time I'd see my grandson before his mother's world came crashing down. "Wonderful! How about Saturday afternoon? Around 1 o'clock? "Saturday works perfectly." After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and smiled. Jessica had just given me the perfect opportunity to say goodbye to Tyler before I destroyed his mother's life. It was almost too poetic to be real. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. I met Robert Chen at his office that afternoon. His law firm occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building, with windows that overlooked the city where Jessica thought she ruled her small kingdom. Robert had been handling my legal affairs since my father's death, and he was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my holdings. "I've pulled all the documentation for 847 Maple Street, he said, spreading papers across his mahogany desk. "The deed is crystal clear. You're the sole owner, free and clear. No liens, no encumbrances, no complications." I picked up the deed and read through it again, even though I'd memorized every word years ago. "Beverly Catherine Morrison, sole owner in fee simple absolute." The legal language was unambiguous. I owned every square inch of that house, from the foundation to the roof. "There's something I need to ask you, Beverly," Robert said, his tone careful. "Does your son know that you own the house he's living in?" I met his eyes. "No. He thinks he and Jessica bought it themselves." Robert nodded slowly. He'd been practicing law for 30 years, and he'd seen enough family dynamics to understand the implications. "And Jessica? Does she know?" "She has no idea." "I see." He made a note on his legal pad. "This could be complicated. When they discover that you're selling, there may be emotional reactions, legal challenges even." "What kind of legal challenges?" I asked. "Well, they've been paying what they believe is a mortgage for 3 years. They've been paying property taxes, homeowners insurance, utilities. They've invested money in improvements and renovations. A court might consider them to have some equity interest, even if they're not on the deed." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you saying they could fight the sale?" "Not successfully," Robert said quickly. "The deed is ironclad. You have every legal right to sell, but they could try to delay things, claim they have tenant rights or that there was some kind of implied agreement. It could get messy." I thought about this for a moment. The last thing I wanted was a prolonged legal battle that would drag out the process and give Jessica time to manipulate the situation. How do we prevent that? Speed, Robert said simply. The faster we move, the less time they have to mount any kind of response. Sandra Williams called me an hour ago. She already has 3 investors interested in a quick purchase. We could have an offer by tomorrow and close within a week if you're willing to accept a slightly below market price. How much below market? The house is probably worth around $520,000 in today's market. For a week-long close, you'd probably get around $480,000. I almost laughed. Jessica had spent 3 years thinking she lived in a $315,000 house. Tomorrow she'd discover it was worth over $500,000 and that she was about to lose every penny of equity she thought she'd built up. Do it, I said. Robert started pulling together the paperwork. As he worked, I found myself thinking about the improvements Jessica had made to the house. She'd spent at least $40,000 over the past 3 years, money they could barely afford. New hardwood floors in the living room, a renovated kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, a finished basement where Tyler could play. Every improvement had been documented on her social media accounts. Photos of the kitchen renovation, complete with captions about making our house a home. Videos of Tyler running around the finished basement with Jessica's voice narrating, "So grateful we could give him this space to be a kid." She'd built her entire identity around that house. It wasn't just where she lived. It was proof of her success, her taste, her ability to create the perfect family environment. She'd invited friends over for dinner parties where she could show off her decorating skills. She'd hosted book club meetings in the living room she'd painted and furnished herself. She'd created an Instagram-worthy life in every room, and tomorrow all of it would be gone. "There's one more thing," Robert said, interrupting my thoughts. "We need to discuss notice requirements. Legally, we have to give them notice that the house is being sold, but there's no requirement for advance notice. We can serve them papers at the same time we list the property." "What kind of papers?" "Notice to quit. It's a formal notification that their tenancy is being terminated due to sale of the property. They'll have 30 days to vacate." 30 days. I tried to imagine Jessica's face when she received those papers. 30 days to pack up 3 years' worth of memories, to find a new place to live, to explain to Tyler why they had to leave the only home he'd ever known. "Is there any way they could challenge the notice to quit?" I asked. "Not really. You're the owner. You have the right to sell, and the new owners will want vacant possession. It's pretty straightforward." I signed the papers authorizing Robert to proceed with the sale and the eviction notice. As I was gathering my purse to leave, he handed me a business card. "This is Detective Maria Santos with the Police Department Civil Division," he said. "If things get ugly tomorrow, and they might, she can help ensure the papers are served properly and that there are no incidents." Incidents? "Beverly, you're about to destroy this woman's entire world. Her home, her security, her identity. Everything she's built her life around for the past 3 years. People don't always react rationally to that kind of shock." I pocketed the card, trying not to think about what kind of incidents he was worried about. Jessica was manipulative and cruel, but I'd never thought of her as violent. Then again, I'd never taken away everything she cared about before. I drove home feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop I couldn't see the bottom of. Tomorrow morning, I would drive to 847 Maple Street. I would knock on the door of my own house. I would hand Jessica the papers that would end her reign as queen of her perfect little kingdom, and then I would watch her world collapse. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove past the house. I parked across the street and sat in my car, looking at the home I'd bought but never truly lived in. The lights were on in the kitchen window. I could see Jessica moving around inside, probably cooking dinner for her family. The dining room chandelier was lit, casting warm light through the sheer curtains she'd hung to replace the blinds that had been there when she moved in. Tyler's bicycle was lying on its side in the front yard, next to the flower bed Jessica had planted last spring. The garden was looking beautiful. She'd always had a talent for making things grow. For a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been regret. This was my grandson's home. These were his memories. That bicycle, that garden, the tire swing hanging from the oak tree in the backyard, all of it would be gone in 30 days. But then I remembered yesterday's phone call. Ignore that unbearable old woman. She's a burden. I remembered 3 years of being pushed aside, ignored, systematically erased from my own family's life. Jessica had made her choice. She'd chosen to treat me like garbage while living in my house, spending my money, building her perfect life on a foundation she didn't even know belonged to me. Tomorrow, she'd learn the price of that choice. I started my car and drove home, my phone buzzing with a text message from Sandra Williams. 3 offers already. Highest is $475K, All cash, 7-day close. Do you want me to accept? I typed back, yes, schedule the paperwork for tomorrow morning. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that by this time tomorrow, Jessica's house would belong to someone else. Someone who would want her gone, who would have the legal right to make her leave, who wouldn't care about her granite countertops or her carefully chosen paint colors. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 years, powerful. Tomorrow, Jessica would discover that the unbearable old woman she'd dismissed so casually held the deed to everything she thought she owned. Tomorrow, she'd learn that calling someone a burden can be the most expensive mistake you ever make. I set my alarm for 7 a.m. I wanted to get to the house early before Jessica had time to start her day, before she could put on the mask of false politeness she always wore when she had to deal with me. Tomorrow, there would be no more masks. I woke up at 6 a.m. without needing my alarm. My heart was pounding before I was even fully conscious, adrenaline coursing through my veins like I was preparing for battle. In a way, I suppose I was. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue pantsuit I'd bought for my retirement party 3 years ago. I wanted to look professional, authoritative. I wanted Jessica to see that the woman she'd dismissed as a burden was someone who commanded respect. At 8 a.m. sharp, I met Robert at his office to pick up the paperwork. The sale contract had been finalized overnight, $475,000, all cash, closing in 7 days. The buyers were investors who planned to renovate and flip the property. They didn't care about Jessica's granite countertops or her carefully chosen paint colors. To them, the house was just another investment opportunity. The notice to quit is ready as well, Robert said, handing me a thick manila envelope. Everything is perfectly legal and properly documented. Once you serve these papers, they have 30 days to vacate the premises. My hands trembled slightly as I took the envelope. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own property, had led to this moment. Are you sure you want to do this yourself? Robert asked. I could send someone else to serve the papers. No, I said firmly. This needs to come from me. The drive to 847 Maple Street took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. I knew Jessica's routine well enough to time my arrival perfectly. Mark would have left for work by now, but Jessica worked from home and rarely left the house before 10 a.m. Tyler would be at school. I wanted her alone when her world collapsed. I parked in the driveway right behind Jessica's white SUV. For 3 years, I'd parked on the street when I visited, as if I were just another guest who didn't belong in the family space. Today, I parked like an owner. The front door still had the wreath Jessica had hung there last fall, a beautiful arrangement of autumn leaves and miniature pumpkins that she'd probably spent $50 on. She'd always been good at making things look perfect on the surface. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the frosted glass panels beside the door, I could see movement inside. Jessica approaching, probably wondering who would be visiting so early in the morning. The door opened, and there she was. Jessica Miller, 28 years old, blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater. She looked like what she was, a suburban housewife who'd never had to worry about where her next meal was coming from, who'd built her entire identity around a house she thought she owned. Beverly? She blinked in surprise, then forced that familiar fake smile. What a surprise. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, I said, my voice calm and steady. May I come in? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to catch it, then stepped aside. Of course, come in. Can I get you some coffee? I walked into the foyer, looking around at the home I'd bought but Jessica had claimed. The hardwood floors gleamed. She'd had them professionally refinished last year. The walls were painted a warm cream color that complemented the antique mirror she'd hung beside the coat closet. Coffee would be nice, I said. Jessica led me to the kitchen, chattering nervously as we walked. I was just thinking about calling you, actually. Tyler's been asking about you. He's so excited about your lunch date on Saturday. Another lie. Tyler had barely acknowledged my existence the last time I'd seen him, too absorbed in his tablet to notice when I'd said goodbye. The kitchen was Jessica's masterpiece. She'd spent months renovating it 2 years ago, replacing the perfectly functional cabinets with custom ones, installing granite countertops, buying high-end appliances they couldn't afford. She'd documented every step of the process on social media, posting photos with captions like "creating my dream kitchen" and "so blessed to be making this house our forever home." Forever home. The irony was almost too perfect. Sit, Jessica said, gesturing to the breakfast bar. I just made a fresh pot. I remained standing, the manila envelope clutched in my hands. Jessica, I need to talk to you about something important. She paused in the middle of reaching for coffee mugs, her back still to me. Oh, what about? About this house. She turned around and I saw something flicker across her face. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of unease. What about it? I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment I'd been building toward for 3 years. The moment when all of Jessica's cruelty would finally have consequences. I need you to know that I heard what you said yesterday during my phone call with Mark. Jessica's face went pale. She set the coffee mugs down with trembling hands. Beverly. You called me an unbearable old woman, I continued, my voice steady and calm. You said I was a burden. You told my son to ignore me. I didn't mean, yes, you did. I stepped closer to the breakfast bar, placing the manila envelope on the granite countertop she was so proud of. You meant every word. And now you're going to face the consequences of those words. Jessica stared at the envelope like it was a snake that might bite her. What is that? Open it. Her hands shook as she picked up the envelope and tore it open. I watched her face as she read the first document, the sale contract. I watched the confusion turn to disbelief, then to something approaching panic. I don't understand, she whispered. This says you're selling our house. I'm selling my house, I corrected her. The house I own. The house you've been living in for 3 years without ever knowing who actually held the deed. The blood drained from Jessica's face completely. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. That's impossible. We bought this house. We have a mortgage. We pay property taxes. You have a mortgage on a house I own, I said. I bought this property 3 years ago and arranged for you and Mark to think you were buying it yourselves. Every payment you've made, every dollar you've spent on improvements, every night you've slept in what you thought was your bedroom, all of it has been in my house. Jessica's legs gave out. She sank onto one of the bar stools, still clutching the sale documents. Why would you do that? Because I wanted to see what kind of person you really were, I said. I wanted to know how you'd treat Mark's mother when you thought she had nothing to offer you. Beverly, please. You failed the test, Jessica. Spectacularly. She was reading through the documents now, her eyes wide with horror as the reality sank in. You can't do this. We've lived here for 3 years. We have rights. Read the second document. With shaking hands, she pulled out the notice to quit. I watched her read it, watched her understand that she had 30 days to pack up her perfect life and leave. You're evicting us? Her voice was barely a whisper. The new owners want vacant possession. They close in 7 days. Jessica started to cry then. Not the delicate tears of a woman trying to manipulate a situation, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose entire world was crashing down around her. Please, she choked out. Please don't do this. Tyler, this is his home, his school, his friends. You should have thought about Tyler before you called his grandmother a burden. I was upset. I didn't mean it. Please, Beverly, we can work this out. I'll apologize to Mark. It's too late for apologies, I said, my voice as cold as I'd ever heard it. The sale is final. The papers are signed. You have 30 days. Jessica's sobs grew louder, more desperate. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have money for a security deposit. For moving expenses, you should have thought of that before you spent 3 years treating me like garbage in my own house. I turned to leave, but Jessica's voice stopped me. Wait, she called out, her voice cracking. The renovations, we spent $40,000 on improvements. We added value to your property. You owe us. I turned back to face her, and I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. I owe you nothing, Jessica. You chose to spend money on a house you never owned. You chose to renovate property that was never yours. Just like you chose to treat me like a burden while living under my roof. I walked toward the front door, leaving Jessica sobbing in the kitchen she'd been so proud of. As I reached for the door handle, I heard her voice one last time, high and desperate. Beverly, please, I have nowhere else to go. I paused with my hand on the door. You should have thought of that yesterday, I said without turning around, when you told my son to ignore that unbearable old woman. I walked out of my house for the last time, leaving Jessica to face the ruins of the kingdom she'd built on my generosity. Behind me, I could hear her calling Mark's number, her voice hysterical as she tried to explain the impossible situation she'd just discovered. But Mark was at work, and even if he answered, what could he possibly do? The house was sold, the papers were signed, and the burden Jessica had wanted to ignore now held all the power. I got in my car and drove away, feeling lighter than I had in 3 years. 3 weeks later, I sat in my new living room, watching the evening news while sipping tea from a delicate china cup, one of many beautiful things I'd finally allowed myself to enjoy. After years of pretending to live on a fixed income, I'd moved into a stunning 2-bedroom condo in the upscale Riverside district. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the river, and the morning sunlight filled every room. I was no longer hiding who I was. My phone had been quiet for the past week. The frantic calls from Mark had finally stopped. The desperate text messages from Jessica had dwindled to nothing. The chapter of my life where I'd allowed myself to be treated as a burden was officially closed. The last conversation I'd had with Mark still played in my mind sometimes. He'd called 3 days after I'd served Jessica the papers, his voice strained with disbelief and anger. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Jessica says you're selling our house? She says you own it? That can't be true." "It's completely true," I'd said calmly. "But how? We bought this house. We have a mortgage. You have a mortgage on my property, Mark. I purchased that house and arranged the sale to make you think you could afford it. I wanted to see how Jessica would treat your mother when she thought I had nothing to offer." The silence on the other end of the line had lasted so long, I'd wondered if the call had dropped. "You've been lying to us for 3 years?" His voice had been barely controlled. "I've been protecting myself for 3 years. And it's a good thing I did, because Jessica showed me exactly who she really is." "She made a mistake, Mom. She was stressed. She meant every word, Mark, and you know it." That had been the end of our conversation. Mark had hung up without saying goodbye, and I hadn't heard from him since. I'd heard about them through the neighborhood grapevine, though. Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street from my old house, had called to let me know that Mark and Jessica had moved out 2 days before the deadline. They'd rented a small apartment across town, in a building that allowed pets but not much else in the way of amenities. "Such a shame," Mrs. Patterson had said. "That beautiful house. All those improvements Jessica made. The new owners are planning to gut the whole kitchen and start over." I'd felt a moment of satisfaction at that news. All of Jessica's carefully chosen fixtures, all her Pinterest-perfect design choices, would be ripped out and thrown away. The kitchen she'd spent months perfecting would be nothing but debris in a dumpster. The irony was perfect. Yesterday, I'd received an unexpected visitor. I'd been reading on my balcony when the doorman called to say that a young boy was asking to see me. When I'd gone down to the lobby, I'd found Tyler standing there with a woman I didn't recognize, probably Jessica's sister, based on the family resemblance. "Hi, Grandma," Tyler had said quietly, his eyes downcast. My heart had nearly broken. He looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile. The confident little boy who'd once ignored me in favor of his video games was gone, replaced by a child who seemed lost and confused. "Hello, sweetheart," I'd said, kneeling down to his level. "What are you doing here? Mom said I should come see you. She said to tell you she's sorry and that she hopes you can forgive her." The woman with him, definitely Jessica's sister, had shifted uncomfortably. "Jessica wanted to come herself, but she thought you might not want to see her." She was right about that. I'd spent an hour with Tyler in the building's garden, listening to him talk about his new school and his new apartment. He'd been careful not to say anything negative about the move, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. His whole world had been uprooted because of his mother's cruelty. When it was time for him to go, he'd hugged me tighter than he had in years. "I miss you, Grandma," he'd whispered. "I miss you too, baby," I'd whispered back. But I hadn't changed my mind. I couldn't. Jessica had made her choice when she called me a burden, when she spent 3 years systematically erasing me from my own family's life. The consequences of that choice weren't my responsibility to fix. Now, sitting in my beautiful new home, I realized something I hadn't expected. I was genuinely happy. For the first time in years, I woke up each morning without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on me. I could read my books in peace, take long walks by the river, visit museums without having to rush home to accommodate someone else's schedule. I'd joined a book club at the community center, where women my age gathered weekly to discuss novels and share stories. They knew me as Beverly Morrison, retired nurse and widow, but they didn't know about my properties or my money. They liked me for who I was, not what I could provide for them. I'd also started volunteering at a local nursing home, reading to residents who didn't get many visitors. It was heartbreaking work sometimes, seeing elderly people whose families had forgotten them, but it was also deeply meaningful. I knew what it felt like to be dismissed as irrelevant, and I could offer genuine empathy to others experiencing the same pain. The volunteer coordinator, a kind woman named Sarah, had mentioned last week that one of the residents reminded her of me. She used to be a nurse too, Sarah had said. But her daughter-in-law convinced her son that she was becoming a burden. They put her here and rarely visit. It's so sad. She's sharp as a tack, but they treat her like she's already gone. I'd spent extra time with that resident, a woman named Dorothy, who'd worked as a pediatric nurse for 40 years. Her story was different from mine, but the underlying cruelty was the same. Families who saw elderly relatives as inconveniences rather than people. Children who chose their spouse's comfort over their parents' dignity. The worst part, Dorothy had told me during one of our conversations, is that I helped raise that boy. I sacrificed everything for him, and now he acts like I'm the problem. I'd understood completely. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my thoughts. It was from Robert Chen. Final closing completed today. House sold for $475,000. After expenses, your net proceeds are $462,000. Funds will be transferred to your account tomorrow. Nearly $500,000 from the sale of a house Jessica had thought belonged to her. Money that would go toward my comfortable retirement, toward my charitable giving, toward anything I chose, because it was mine. I set my phone down and walked to my window, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the river. Somewhere out there, Jessica was probably struggling to make rent on her small apartment, probably fighting with Mark about money and blame and whose fault it all was. Somewhere out there, Tyler was learning to adapt to a new school, new friends, a smaller bedroom in a building without a backyard. I felt sorry for Tyler. I even felt sorry for Mark in a way. He'd been caught between his mother and his wife, and he'd made the choice that seemed easier at the time. But I didn't feel sorry for Jessica. She'd created this situation with her own cruelty, her own arrogance, her own assumption that she could treat me however she wanted without consequences. For 3 years, she'd been the queen of a castle that was never hers. She'd built her identity around a house she didn't own, spent money she couldn't afford on improvements to someone else's property, treated the actual owner like an unwelcome servant, and now she knew the truth. I was no longer the unbearable old woman she could ignore. I was no longer the burden she could push aside. I was the woman who'd held all the power while she'd held nothing but illusions. The victory wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no crowds cheering, no public vindication, but it was complete. I made myself another cup of tea and settled back into my chair, surrounded by the quiet comfort of a life that was finally, truly mine. Outside my windows, the city hummed with the lives of millions of people, but inside my home there was peace. For the first time in 3 years, no one was calling me a burden, and that was enough.